Hello, everybody, at 6 o'clock. So thank you for joining us tonight for the resumption of our Authors Talk series. And in fact, we have two collaborators, an author, Nash, and the photographer of this book that we're talking about tonight, Sky High. A look at recent super tall architecture in New York. This was going to be a kind of tag team presentation of the book with the introduction and overview by Nash, who wrote the text and conceived the project, and then his collaborator, the architectural photographer, Bruce Katz. The Skyscraper Museum has paid a great deal of attention over these last few years, and actually nearly 10 years of the kind of evolution of the super slender tower in the city, which we began to plot in an exhibition called, not coincidentally, Sky High, just like the title of our book tonight, except the subtitle of that was The Logic of Luxury. And I'm going to show you a few images from our analysis that kind of built the foundation for that exhibition, which was actually presented before every but one of the towers that were shown in the show were completed. And so this was an analysis of the typology of the Supertall. Now, I wanted to go over this a little bit, and I'm tap dancing a little bit because I think the kind of counterpoint to the way the Skyscraper Museum looked at the subject as a kind of explication of the factors that are brought to the design table, the development table, the engineering problems of the Supertall is very different than the critics' view of the completed buildings. And of course, the photographers, and I have to say, after talking to Bruce a little bit before this, before we began, really the celebration of the skyline in his very beautiful photography. And so in that sense, we're very close. The Skyscraper Museum's Sky High exhibition and the Sky High book that we'll be talking about tonight. So in order for me to just set up that problem that is the background of the Supertall, let me just show you some of the buildings, which were only renderings when we did our show, but you're going to see Bruce Katz's photographs of tonight. And you see about, I guess, 14 of them here, and there are many more that have been added since 2014, when we mounted the exhibition, and then when in other kind of scholarly papers and other lectures that we've presented have fleshed out these buildings as they actually do appear on the skyline. So you see the typology as each of these buildings is seen separately rather than in their skyline context described here. And so all I'm doing is showing you in these kind of charts of the Supertall typology that it is a kind of building type that is really born in New York, and I would say it's indigenous to New York, and it's even unique to New York, is an argument that I've made in other contexts. And I think if you compare the slenderness that you see in this graph, in effect, of the silhouettes of New York Supertalls, you can see that they are similar but different than the buildings that you see around the world that represent the super slender type in buildings that are all of 1,000 feet tall or 300 meters or taller, so qualifying as super talls. And you can see in purple on our graph the two New York examples that were, well, actually there are three that were completed at the time. And all of the other buildings that you see in blue or in China, there are buildings around the world, in the Middle East, in China, in Southeast Asia, that participate in this typology. But you can see in this comparative graph, none are so slender as the New York example. So that's the kind of characteristic that we looked at in the exhibition, Sky High and the Logic of Luxury. But now we're just going to enjoy the buildings. This is one of a series of investigations and looks at, studies of, surveys of the contemporary Manhattan skyscraper, because Eric started quite a few years ago with a 3-edition series called Manhattan Skyscrapers with Princeton Architectural Press. And they're going back to the early 20th century, I guess, is the first edition, for which I had the honor of writing the introduction, I think. Eric has been keeping up to date with both his look at these buildings, but also with an architectural photographer paired with his text with a particular vision and kind of collection of interests. So in addition to the Sky High and Manhattan Skyscrapers, Eric has written about Art Deco, both in Miami and also in New York. And he holds something of a record for being a speaker twice within our same fiscal year, because he spoke earlier this year about his book, Art Deco, Birds and Beasts. Beasts and Birds?
Birds, Beasts, and Blooms.
And Blooms, yes. So the decorative traditions, but also inventions on New York architecture. But I didn't read the subtitle of the book that you can see here. So Sky High, a critique of New York City's super tall towers from top to bottom. And the top to bottom is important, but the critical eye is something that Eric has also brought to this volume. And so we're going to let him give us his view of these buildings now in a talk. So Eric Nash.
Hello and welcome. Glad you're here. Public reaction to the new super tall towers, those over 300 meters or 1,000 feet, has been decidedly mixed, I think for 2 reasons. One is that they are viewed as the province of the super rich in a city that has become unaffordable even for the traditional middle class. Another reason is their sheer scale, that they are so new upon the landscape. This response, in fact, is not so new. Verticalism has always been the logic of Manhattan, because the real estate is so limited and so valuable, and because its bedrock is ideal for building tall. This cartoon from 1908 shows how New Yorkers of that era feared that skyscrapers leading up to the 555-foot tall Equitable building, completed 7 years later, would overwhelm traditional landmarks like Trinity Church, built in 1846, which at 281 feet had reigned for more than 4 decades as the tallest man-made point in the city. Henry James returned from Europe in 1909 to find his beloved brownstone New York populated by monsters of the mere market. It takes historical perspective to appreciate what is good about an era after the initial shock. As an example, our beloved Art Deco skyline, which characterizes the very essence of the city and to which super talls are sometimes invidiously compared, was new when it appeared in the 1920s and 30s as a creative response to the setback zoning code of 1916. The style was not universally popular. Influential architectural critics of the time, like Lewis Mumford of the New Yorker, were not enamored of the new tall buildings. The Chrysler, which Bruce noted was dismissed as stunt architecture, was seen as just an advertisement for Chrysler automobiles. The art critic Clement Greenberg, who championed abstract expressionist painters like Jackson Pollock, made the observation that any new work of art is profoundly ugly because it challenges accepted standards of beauty. Australian art critic Robert Hughes coined the phrase, "the shock of the new," to describe how new aesthetics affect the observer. After the war came a new type of skyscraper, the all-glass curtain wall building. The first one stands at the base of Park Avenue, Lever House, by Gordon Bunshaft of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Gone were the appealing decorative touches like carved gargoyles and Gothic crenellations. Which brings us to the newest iteration of the skyscraper, the Supertall. Let me preface this by saying that we have already had Supertalls in the city long before the current crop on what has come to be known as Billionaires Row. The original World Trade Towers were both more than 1,000 feet tall and also were met initially with mixed reactions. Some felt they unbalanced the skyline of the traditional grouping of skyscrapers midtown and on Wall Street. But even before the tragedy of 9/11, they became accepted as a symbol of civic pride. You see here the memorials in their footprints. And they were depicted in representations of the skyline as often as the Empire State Building. One key difference with the latest generation of Supertalls is their slenderness ratio, like shop architects' 91-story, 1,428-foot tall Steinway Tower, which has a base to height ratio of 1:24, the equivalent of 2 school rulers set atop one another, making it currently the slenderest skyscraper in the world. The effect is accentuated by the open fretwork crown, which makes the building seem to evanesce into the air. The first Supertall to be completed on Billionaires Row was Christiane de Portzamparc's hooded, blue-skinned 157 in 2014. Citizens groups were already protesting it even before it was completed, marching with furled umbrellas against the shadows the tower presumably would cast on Central Park, a fear that turned out to be unfounded. The towers do cast long shadows, but they are rapid moving compared with those of older, bulkier buildings, which in fact cast steadier blocks of shade for longer periods of time. 157 drew the most ire because it was so new, so tall, and frankly, so blue. Portzamparc said he was going for a Klimt effect with the variegated blue paneling, but Michael Kimmelman of the New York Times saw it otherwise. "The conceit is falling water," he wrote. "The effect, a heap of volumes, not liquid, but stolidly, chinsily embellished, clad in acres of eyeshadow blue glass, offset by a pox of tinted panes like age spots." Another reason the building was a lightning rod for controversy was that it seemed to have sprouted up overnight without any forewarning. In fact, Supertalls are built according to a legal code called AOR, or as of right, which means that the developer must buy up air rights from surrounding buildings before he can build tall. The developer had quietly planned for a decade, cobbling together air rights from surrounding buildings. Today, the building does not have quite the shock value it once had, since so many Supertalls have arisen nearby, like the 131 floor 1,550-foot Central Park Tower, the tallest residential tower in the Western Hemisphere, although it cheats a little because the base is commercial, the Nordstrom flagship. Infill buildings are going up directly next to 157, which will also serve to make it not look so lonely on the horizon and normalize its height. In order for supertalls to predominate, two factors had to come together. The first was economic. Traditionally, the wealthy preferred lots of floor space in their apartments. While address has always been a status indicator, sheer height was not. A glimpse of the flower-bedecked meridian on Park Avenue was deemed sufficient. This changed radically in the new millennium. Developers around the world found there was a burgeoning market for sheer height as a residential status indicator. The ultra-wealthy were suddenly willing to pay tens of millions for cabins in the sky as small as 700 square feet, as long as they had a spectacular view. Once this new market was tapped, the sky was the limit. Concomitant with this new demand were radical changes in structural engineering that allowed architects to build higher than they ever dreamed. You have to realize that each of these supertalls, like the late Raphael Vignoli's 432 Park, is an experiment with a number of unknown variables. All tall buildings sway in the wind. The question is, how much sway is acceptable? In his talk here at the Skyscraper Museum, Vignoli described bringing a mock-up of 432 Park to a highly realistic wind tunnel in Canada, complete with simulated rain and lightning. The architect was forced to decide on an arbitrary feel of how much sway was acceptable. Gone are the days of classic steel cage construction, like in photos of the Empire State Building going up, when rivet gangs poised perilously on I-beams. Today's supertalls are composed around an inner concrete core with attached concrete floor plates supported by an exterior perimeter of large steel reinforced concrete columns, usually poured in place. You can see the structure here in the ground floor of One Vanderbilt next to Grand Central Terminal. Another engineering feat that allows building on such small plots of ground is cantilevering. All of Hudson Yards is cantilevered on a deck over the former Long Island Railroad yards, seen here in the foreground, an enormous piece of real estate, Midtown, lying fallow next to some of the most valuable real estate on earth. Pre-pandemic, at least, when the majority of the workforce commuted to the office, it looked like a gold mine. One cantilevered supertall at Hudson Yards, SOM's glass tower at 1 Manhattan West at 995 feet, is a little uninspired on the exterior, although I must say that Bruce captured quite an inspiring image of it here. But you can see the gigantic concrete core that supports it in this shot of the lobby. The most interesting use of cantilevering is the Steinway Tower, which protected Warren and Wetmore's 1925 showroom by tunneling under its foundations and cantilevering the tower from a new base. The showroom, which we couldn't photograph because it was covered by canopies, features a larger-than-life tympanum by the Italian sculptor Leo Lentilli of Apollo with a Lyre and His Muse, a highlight on 57th Street. Central Park South also uses cantilevering, but in a less original way. In order to maximize park views, the developers bought up air rights from the adjacent Art Students League and hung what looks like a motorcycle sidecar above it that projects out 30 feet in space. The result is not entirely pleasing, but it did manage to keep the palatial townhouse that housed the art school, designed by Henry J. Hardenberg in 1892, intact and afloat financially, because the air rights were purchased for nearly $32 million. This being New York, people still complained. But I think Supertalls may be evidence of a new era of mindfulness in city construction. None of the Supertalls we show caused irreplaceable architecture to be destroyed, and a number of them, like Jean Nouvel's 53 West 53rd, enhance the infrastructure. Just as the poet Wallace Stevens wrote that there are 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, let me suggest to you that there are at least 5 ways of looking at a supertall: its impact at street level, contextually and functionally, how it affects the skyline as an aesthetic object, and how it advances the by now long discourse of skyscraper history. I think it is a common reaction among the public to dismiss all of the supertalls with a wave of the hand on the grounds that no building should be so tall. Let me address that in more strictly architectural terms. To dismiss supertalls is to ignore 2 dimensions. One, that they have already become the predominant typology of the early 21st century, largely driven by market forces in increasingly dense urban centers around the globe. And 2, that not all supertalls are created equal. If we can step back to see beyond their sheer height, we will discover that these monsters of the mere market can be considered a new art form. Let's take 3 particularly good examples from the dozen supertalls covered in our book, completed in the last decade, which solve the problem of small plots of land and super height in different ways. My favorite, for many reasons, is Raphael Vignoli's 432 Park Avenue. I think the marvelous thing about it, which you may not realize upon first sight, is that the form is the structure. The shell of white Portland cement that we see here, by the way, a common construction material, unlike marble or more costly stone you would expect to see in exclusive luxury housing, is in fact what holds the building up. The principle is the same as Eero Saarinen's Black Rock CBS Tower of 1961. 432 is distinguished by its perfect geometry. Its footprint is a 93 by 93 foot square, and each facade is a grid of square windows, 10 foot on a side. At street level, the tower fits unobtrusively into a doll's shoe of a pocket park on a side street. Viewed from the mid-distance, the tower's equilateral geometry draws it down to a comprehensible height. Seen from afar, it is a gleaming classical pillar on the skyline, a piece of minimalist sculpture echoic of the original World Trade Towers. A Supertall that exceeds at all levels in terms of urban contextualism and originality on the skyline is Jean Nouvel's 1,050-foot 53 West 53rd. Let's not forget that one of the great contributions of the Art Deco style is that buildings could be decorative and entertaining as well as functional. 53 West 53 conforms to the setbacks prescribed by the zoning code of 1916, but rather than employing 90-degree setbacks, certainly the easiest for engineers to build, Nouvel's design looks back to the renderings of skyscraper visionary Hugh Ferris, who imagined skylines that more resembled crystalline shards. The building is extremely well integrated at street level, where it incorporates 3 new floors of gallery space for MoMA. Cone Peterson Fox's 1,401-foot tall One Vanderbilt pays tribute to the traditional Art Deco skyline with its slanted setback crown. At night, the setbacks are playfully illuminated like a ghost bicycle. The building is by no means slender, containing 1.8 million square feet of commercial space. The blueprints were drawn up in the pre-COVID era when Mayor de Blasio wanted to beef up the Midtown business district. Another Supertall, SOM's 1,575-foot tall Project Commodore, is planned for the site of the Hyatt Hotel just east of Grand Central. Not only is there a question of whether these buildings are too big for 42nd Street, but there may not be enough demand for office space because of office employees now working remotely. The question whether you can fill a Supertall is still up in the air, so to speak. Shares in office lease companies are tumbling as vacancies soar, while companies like Google are demanding their employees return to the office. Now let's look at the new groups of Supertalls, the World Trade Center and Hudson Yards, and compare them with our existing complexes, Rockefeller Center and Lincoln Center. I think it's worthwhile looking at the new Supertalls as a composition rather than just individual buildings. Built in 2014, David Child's 1,776-foot tall One World Trade, better known as the Freedom Tower, is the oldest Supertall in our book. It has become an icon of the city, as recognized as the Empire State Building, so it seems unfair to criticize it, but the attempt to reach 1,776 feet is a bit of a cheat because a full third of its height is taken up by an ordinary disproportionate antenna. The best effect of the building is its skin. The spandrels, or horizontal supports, are placed behind the glass so that the tower appears to be sheathed in a single crystalline surface that interacts marvelously with the sky's atmospherics at different times of day and different moods of weather. The other Supertall in the group is the mightily braced 1,079-foot tall 3 World Trade Center by Roger Stirk Harbor, completed in 2018. Along with the near Supertall 4 World Trade Center by Fumihiko Maki, which falls just short of the 300-meter mark at 298 meters or 978 feet, the buildings are content to serve as foils to the centerpiece of the Freedom Tower. Like Rockefeller Center, the World Trade Center is an emotionally engaging, even entertaining public space, drawing you through a variety of experiences, from the uplifting Freedom Tower, the light-filled Oculus by Santiago Calatrava, to the solemnity of the perpetually weeping cisterns of the reflecting absence memorial seen here at night, where people stand in hushed reverence as opposed to the tourist gaiety of the observation deck. The Supertalls do not intrude, but rather stand as protective guardians. Hudson Yards, I think, is quite another story. It does have a certain entertainment value connected to the High Line, and with a superb viewing platform, the Edge, the highest outdoor platform in the Western Hemisphere, on the Supertall 1,270-foot tall 30 Hudson Yards by Bill Peterson. But I think it fails as a public space on a number of counts. First, it fails as an organic composition of buildings, no matter how good the individual buildings are. Our book covers 4 of the 6 Supertalls: 30 Hudson Yards, David Child's 1,009-foot 35 Hudson Yards in the center, and SOM's rather mundane 995-foot tall 1 Manhattan West, whose proportions somehow fail to convey the spectacular sweep of a Supertall. It goes almost unnoticed among its neighbors. 2 Supertalls were completed after our deadline. Wunderkind Bjarke Ingels' 1,031-foot spiral, distinguished by the gardened zigzag cutouts in its facade that look like they were made with a giant pinking shears, and Sir Norman Foster's somewhat bulky 1,011-foot tall 50 Hudson Yards that contains 3 million square feet of commercial space. Unlike Rockefeller and Lincoln Centers, which had strong central planning, Hudson Yards was only loosely organized, and the architects conferred only a few times. There is little synergy between the buildings. Instead, the effect is of pieces taken randomly from different chess sets, down to the visored knight's helm of 30 Hudson Yards and the slanted bishop's mitre of KPF's 10 Hudson Yards. The complex also raises a more serious question of who owns public space. Hudson Yards is unlike Rockefeller Center, which melds into the grid of city streets, and unlike Lincoln Center, with its open landscaping used as a public park. Instead, it is a highly controlled corporate space dedicated to consumption. Sir Norman Foster said the real test of the Yards is whether it makes for an interesting walk. And I would say, no, it doesn't. The centerpiece sculpture Vessel by Thomas Heatherwick, intended to be as much a symbol of New York as the Statue of Liberty, goes unused. There is not much to do in the Yards or to see except shop for luxury items. Moreover, the building lobbies contain a tremendous amount of what Rem Koolhaas calls junk space, empty space leading to further empty space. The plan was to build out the Yards in 2 phases, covering the second half with decking out to the river's edge, with an additional Supertall. This plan has been thrown into doubt by the current real estate climate. A more sensible approach might be to landscape the acreage and incorporate the riverfront to make it more of a park-like public attraction. The newest Supertall in our book is Shop's 1,066-foot tall 9 decab in downtown Brooklyn, which was having the finishing touches added as we completed the book. A second Brooklyn Supertall is on the way, which is a good thing. Downtown Brooklyn could use interesting architecture, having lain fallow for decades as a parking lot for municipal buildings from the Robert Moses era. In 9 decab, Shop has pulled off another urbanistic coup by incorporating the Pantheon-like dime savings bank as its lobby, much as the firm designed around the Steinway showroom. Built in 2 stages in 1908 and 1932, the neoclassical bank was the first building in the United States to employ marble from ancient Greek quarries. The rationale behind the skyscraper's bronze coloring will probably be lost among most of the public. It's meant as a contextual reference to the color of the coffered ceiling inside the dome of the bank. One special treat inside are the column capitals that feature large Liberty dimes instead of the FDR dime we are familiar with, because the president was still alive. Whether Supertalls remain a sustainable typology for the 21st century is an open question that depends on myriad factors. Even though New York is home to the greatest number of billionaires in the world, 156 at last count, will the global economy sustain a supply of super wealthy people able to afford tenancy in Supertalls? What is the future of work? And will remote work antiquate the need for large office spaces, which already seems to be occurring? Ecological concerns are also part of the picture. Manhattan is right at sea level. The vast majority of Supertalls are built in coastal cities at a time when the future of global warming and rising sea levels is uncharted. One alarming statistic is that Lower Manhattan is actually sinking under the weight of its buildings.
Architectural photographer Bruce Katz is going to sit right here now.
I really was going to talk about how I approached photographing these buildings here in New York to give you guys context on how the buildings feel in New York, how they work on the ground now. My thoughts about all of this stuff is much closer to probably a layperson. I don't have a degree in architecture. I've been photographing it now for probably close to 40 years. And, while the history of architecture and Supertalls, there's a lot to draw on. I'm looking at creating interesting images that show the buildings well, and that will allow the viewer or people looking at the photographs to understand the buildings better, to understand how they fit into the city, to understand how people live with them. So with that said, I'm going to talk a little bit just about architectural photography for 1 second. And there's some caveats about doing architectural photography, is that there's a formalism to the photography. And one particular thing that we try and do as architectural photographers, and that is really just keeping the buildings upright. We have used to use specialized gear, a view camera with perspective control. Nowadays it's digital, and we use perspective control lenses to basically, I think all of you know the experience of craning your neck and looking up at the top of a very tall building that it keystones and tends to lean back. And that's kind of the antithesis of what we try and do as architectural photographers. So I want to open here with a kind of a family shot of what's now considered Billionaires Row on Central Park South and West 57th Street. All of these buildings were just completed recently. I mean, if you look close, this was shot probably about 2 years ago. If you look close to Steinway, which is the tallest, slenderest one on the left-hand side of the frame, you can see that it hasn't been fully glassed in yet. One Central Park Tower, I think, is 110 stories. I believe it's the tallest residential building in the Western Hemisphere. And then in the middle, you'll see 157, which was the first of the Supertalls that went up, and people were very critical of that building when it first arrived on the scene. And then you can see Jean Nouvel's beautiful 53 West 53rd next to Steinway. And in the distance, you can see One Vanderbilt, just the top of it. So it's a lovely family portrait, but one of the things that I'm trying to do is present these buildings with a sense of scale and how they interact with New York City. And Central Park, this was one of the few places where I could actually get back from the buildings, show them all together in their full height. You see almost the entire buildings. It's of course masked by the trees in the park. And then people, New Yorkers, using the park. And the footprint of all these new Supertalls are so narrow and thin that the proportions of these buildings, I think, if I recall correctly, that Steinway on the left of your screen is the ratio of footprint to height is something like 1 to 24, which is like two rulers stacked on top of each other. And one of the big criticisms as these were being built is that they were going to be these imposing buildings curtaining off Central Park. And one of the things that, as I was beginning to photograph this project, none of that really came to pass. I think if you look at this photograph, you see that while these buildings are incredibly tall and dominate the sky in height, there is still an amazing openness to the park, and people go about their New York thing, do their New York thing in front of you. To me, there were many opportunities to kind of shoot these buildings from other parts of the park, and I was thinking about having a carriage horse in there to kind of show, but it felt too touristy for me. And so to me, you know, these two people doing yoga or Tai Chi in the foreground, you know, give it both scale and kind of signify New Yorkers doing what they do. That said, one of the big things with doing this project is telling the story, the entire story of the buildings and how they relate to the street level, how people see them on the ground. This is the base of One Vanderbilt. It adjoins Grand Central Terminal. You can just see the awning on the right hand of the screen. It's on 42nd Street, 6 lanes wide, full of traffic, pedestrians, the craziness that's New York City streets these days. And I chose to photograph this at dusk, early evening, for a particular reason. And that is, I wanted to give viewers a sense of how the lobby looks. the idea of inside out, but still holding detail of the architecture and the structure of the building, and how the architects thought about setting it back from the Pocket Park Plaza that adjoins Grand Central. And really just to kind of observe how people interact with it. And there's some wonderful things that are happening. New Yorkers in general, and obviously I can't speak for all of them, but there's a very pragmatic part of being a New Yorker. And that is, if you're commuting into Grand Central, you just want to get to your job on time or get home and, make the 8:38 train or whatever it is at Grand Central. And when you get outside, I'm not sure very many folks are really paying attention to architecture, but they do pay attention to how it feels once you exit Grand Central and you're on the street. And I think the architects here did a very nice job of, at least if it's not the world's greatest architecture, and it's a very layperson's criticism here, but the plaza itself stays open and accessible, and you can grab lunch and eat in there, and it's very comfortable, and it's not like walking through a canyon as soon as you leave the train. So that was the goal of the photography here, to give you a sense of how the building interacts with the streetscape here. Then we kind of flip the script here a little bit. This is the edge in Hudson Yards. I believe it's the highest outdoor observatory, at least in the Western Hemisphere again. I think it's about 100 stories up. And you'll see more images of this. But for me, this was one of the most fun parts of doing this project. This is allows me as an architectural photographer to kind of be a little bit more of a street photographer and photograph how people react and are using this observation platform to see the city. So we flipped the script. Instead of looking at the buildings, we're looking from the buildings and this magnificent view. You're out in the weather, you get a sense of the air. This is much closer to what you would see when you're landing at LaGuardia if you have a window seat in a plane. And I think here for me, the charm of this photo is the body language of this young woman in the frame, who is not quite committed to pressing her face up against the edge of this observation deck, but still enjoying the view. It is definitely not for people that are have a fear of heights. And there is one portion of the observation deck where they have clear glass that you can lay on or look down that certainly terrifies a few people. I happen to really enjoy spending time up here looking. It's you can see scale-wise, sort of mid-lower Manhattan, that there is nothing in the way of buildings in sight, except maybe at the corner you can see One World Trade and out to Brooklyn in the distance. But it really gives you a sense of scale that's really important part of telling the story of these Supertalls. This is much more traditional architectural photography. And this is one of the few cases where, for me at least, the stars align to produce, I think, a signature image of One World Trade. Now, the rebuilding of the World Trade Center, there's all kinds of emotional baggage that's connected with Lower Manhattan and how this was redeveloped. And hopefully Eric will get into some of that in more detail. But for me, there's very few places that you can see, especially from the ground, that feature the building, where the building, you can see the proportions, you can see the architecture, you can see how the light interacts with the building, and you can see it in situ. You can see it, how it relates to the memorial, how it relates to West Street. And this is one of those things where, you know, luck favors the prepared, but luck nonetheless, in that I'm on a setback in Battery Park City, up on the 40-something floor of an office building there, overlooking it. And this is not a view that, unless you work in that office building, you would have, but it really features the building beautifully. And, you know, this really came from having worked in the city for 25 years out of my 40-year career. This was the folks in Battery Park City were a client, and all I had to do was say, "Hey, I'm working on a project. Would you mind if I got up on the setback?" And the other lovely piece of luck is that it was probably the most spectacular day, one of the most spectacular days in New York, and I spent hours up there photographing. And here you'll see the night version of this shot. And one of the things that I love to do to give the viewers, to tell the story of these buildings, is that they take on a much different characteristic in the evenings. And and I think it's important to capture that. I love working in this transitional light, and there are intermediate views of this building, earlier dusk, but this gives you a much more the character of the building. The folks, when they're thinking about even lighting design, how the lights look from inside out, the entire nature of the neighborhood changes as we go through dusk. And New York, being a city that, you know, never sleeps, looking at these buildings at night is as important as considering them in the day. And the architecture literally reflects that. And I think it's a huge part of the story of how we evaluate these buildings. This is the same vantage point, but now we're looking at 3 World Trade, and I believe 4 World Trade that adjoins it. I think one of them is technically a Supertall, and one of them I don't think is. But here you see much earlier in the evening, if you look carefully at the reflection in 4 World Trade, you can actually see the Hudson River and the sunset reflected in there, almost like a mirror. The structure of 3 World Trade with its kind of exoskeleton there, and its relationship to the Oculus and to the 9/11 Museum and to the memorial, gives you a really interesting sense of how these buildings play off of sacred ground, but the idea that these buildings are constructed around a memorial, and they both serve a business function. And one of the things that Eric has said about this is that they sort of stand guardian to the Memorial Plaza and provide a function that way as well. And this is the top of One Vanderbilt. And for me, this is an exercise in, pretty photography. One of the things from a photographic point of view is that these buildings are so tall and slender that that you have to tell the story in pieces. And here, this is one of the few opportunities that I get to use a modestly telephoto lens and look at the building's crown isolated against the sky, and then really just the ability to play with light and shadow to really accentuate the form of the design of the crown. And there's, one other little touch that one of the other Supertalls that we cover in the book, 9 DeKalb out in Brooklyn, is sticking up out of the haze and mist in the middle of the frame. And here we see the exact same building. And again, this idea of rendering the building at night and how it fits in with the rest of Midtown. And here you see, the enormous efforts that folks have gone through to think about how these buildings, will be lit, how the crown looks at night. And this is, as close as you're going to get to tell the story of One Vanderbilt in one shot, maybe adding a day shot as well, which is present in the book. Here we're looking at a detail of 53 West 53rd, the Jean Nouvel building. And Eric talks fairly extensively about it. And hopefully he'll be here to entertain you with that. But for me, the significance of this shot in context of the book and in photography is that one of the things that you're paying for or looking at is the idea of being above everybody here in the city is big bucks. This view, it's a magnificent view. And short of getting in the building and photographing the building from the view, we're now looking at what it's as close as we can get to what an occupant would see. And then you have this wonderful sense of the Upper West Side, and you can see up to Yonkers, and you can kind of understand why people might pay a pretty penny to live there. This is another detail shot of Central Park Tower. And here, again, we're looking at it with a slight telephoto view and just isolating the top of the building and seeing how it plays against the sky. You can get a sense of the architecture a little bit. You can see how it kind of disappears into the clouds a little bit. And again, its slender profile, while it is tall, it is not as imposing as people made it out to be in the beginning. And here we have a similar view of 432 Park, the Raphael Vignoli building, and which I know Eric loves as a masterpiece of minimalist architecture, and he'll go into details as to why. But it's kind of obvious here in its form, its function, and how it looks photographed. And the Chrysler building here, as iconic as it is, and my photography of this is very similar to the previous two slides, that you can identify this building instantly without seeing much of it. This is kind of a very minimalist photo that personally I love, but it also the point that one of the reasons I included it in here is because we've been living with this building for 90 years now. And amazingly, in the beginning, it too came under criticism where it was called, I believe, stunt architecture by a critic. And in looking at the Supertalls that we've got set up here, lovely group shot, it bears keeping that in mind, that out of all the group of buildings that we're showing you, that it's important to realize that a couple of these, who knows where we're going to be in 90 years, but certainly a few of them will pass the test of time and the perspective of good architecture.
Let me ask you the question, and I will then disappear from your shoulders, to talk a little bit about your collaboration, how you got together, how you plotted out the plan of attack, which buildings to include, which ones maybe got away, which surprised you as you saw them, still in Bruce's photographs rather than, you know, as a part of your experience of a pair of eyeballs on the street or in the sky?
Well, actually, our editors didn't want us to include a couple of older Supertalls, including the Bank of America over by Bryant Park. And I wasn't sure why. I think it's because they weren't super slender.
Right.
But we agreed upon the number of buildings with the editors. And then I think Bruce and I had a brief discussion about how I was going to approach it, which was considering the three different levels of skyline, lobby, and sort of the overall, Bruce calls it a hero shot.
Right.
Yeah.
My perspective, you know, I was invited to join the book by Eric, who was a student of mine when I was teaching at ICP, teaching photography at ICP. And we actually did, you know, I mean, as much as we collaborated, I think we had a lot of fun talking about the buildings, talking about trying to get up together to the edge, and making time to jointly look at some of these spaces. But between the pandemic and the nature of doing the work, the photography for the book, which for me was walking a lot around the city, a lot of this was very independent. You know, we didn't talk really about what he was going to say. To me, photographing the buildings beautifully, regardless of what I thought of the buildings architecturally, was paramount. And it does a disservice to everyone if you kind of let your own feelings about the buildings get in the way of creating a beautiful photograph or interesting, compelling photographs. So I really just, I don't remember us talking much about the criticism or what you were going to say about any of the buildings.
Yeah, we kind of took independent paths. I'm glad Bruce chose to find the most appealing images of all the buildings, because actually we want people to like these buildings. I think there's a bit of an aversion to them, and we want people to start accepting them as part of the city and coming to realize what could be visually appealing about them. So it was important to make them all look good, although they do vary in quality.
Yeah.
And just from the very beginning, as Bruce's student, I knew he would be the right person for the job because he's a very technical photographer. And I knew other photographers would be averse to trying to photograph such slender, narrow buildings. The reaction was, you know, what's there to see? It's just a pencil. But as you can tell from the book, there's a lot more if you start looking at how the buildings appear at different times of day and night and from different angles, and particularly the shots which take in the whole scope of the building, which is kind of difficult to find in the city. Usually you're just looking at the crown or at the base, and you don't get a sense of the building as a whole.
And that was really the challenge that I really enjoyed. I mean, doing the photography, one of the things that I love to do for myself is photograph this city, all aspects of it, you know, personal work and the things that I've been shooting over the years. And the idea to try and make something compelling out of pencils, which is, I guess, really how everyone talks about the building. Even to me, I was talking to friends about working on this book, and they said, "Oh, you're shooting all the pencil buildings." And this is what people say about this stuff. And there is, of course, much more to it. But I have to say that even though we're finished with this project, I can't help looking at these buildings. I'm working on a project up in northern Manhattan, in Washington Heights, and you cross the street up in Washington Heights, and you can see you can see 432 Park and a couple of the other buildings in the distance, and it's like, I should have come up here when we were doing the book. The thing about New York is you can shoot the skyline continuously, and you wait 5 minutes and it's changing in some fashion.
One continually surprising element of these buildings is how they pop up on the skyline. You walk to a certain spot and you see, all of a sudden you see 432 Park isolated against the sky. And this is not that different, I noticed, than how buildings like the Chrysler building appear from, say, Allen Street way downtown. It's absolutely perfectly framed by the avenue. So I think there's a pleasant surprise element, certainly to buildings like the World Trade Center seen from Greenwich Village. There's a novelty factor. And I think over time, people will become accustomed to the height and take less umbrage at it. There seems to be a sort of citizens' investment in saying they just shouldn't be there. I'd like to say, I'm not sure how many more will actually be built, although many are planned. The governor would like to see a number of them go up to make Pennsylvania Station a business district on par with the Grand Central Business District. But I don't know if the current climate, at least, will bear this out. So it remains to be seen. I know there's one very ambitious one planned right in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral, whose lobby would be so tall that it would actually frame the cathedral. So we'll see if that actually comes to pass.
Well, I look like I'm a little girl sitting on your shoulders, either that or your conscience, but let me just say
Yes.
back here, since it's a little bit past time for us to close, that I want to thank you both for reminding us why I think the three of us are deliriously in love with New York, and always will be. And Bruce, for you, sort of documenting that, witnessing that, and Eric for phrasing it so beautifully. I do want to put in a plug for our current exhibition at the Skyscraper Museum, because it seems so utterly relevant to this particular talk. And the title of it is Sky Marks, Landmarks. It is a look at the buildings that have been designated as official New York City landmarks since 1965, when we started to protect buildings. And it looks at those buildings that are the skyscrapers among the 1,500 or so landmarks, designated individual landmarks. And that word sky marks is really what Bruce captured and what you're talking about. And landmarks is partly the experience from the street, but it's also the protecting of these buildings for our posterity. So I certainly agree with you, Eric, that in due time, historians will become a chorus about the importance of these buildings. They'll explain them as a moment in time, but there will also be as embraced and beloved as the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building are for New Yorkers generally, and they will become the landmarks of the future. So thanks for in the moment, in the era, in the contemporary moment, to be documenting them for us. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next time for resuming our summer author series, and also our series on the modern concrete skyscraper, which will resume next week, next Tuesday night, with Thomas Leslie and Bill Baker, who will talk about the post-war context in Chicago and structural innovations in the concrete skyscraper. So we see you next time. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.